William Scott Ritter was born July 15, 1961 to a military family in Florida. He graduated high school in 1979, and later college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In 1980 he served in the U.S. Army. In May 1984 he was an intelligence officer in the United States Marine Corps. He served for approximately 12 years. Ritter met his wife, Marina, in Russia in 1989. He was the lead analyst for Marine Corps Rapid Deployment Force during Desert Storm. He later worked as security and military consultant for mainstream media. Scott was the chief United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq between 1991 and 1998. Ritter resigned from the United Nations Special Commission on August 26, 1998. September 3, 1998, several days after his resignation, Ritter testified before the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services and the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and said that he resigned his position. Quote, out of frustration that the United Nations Security Council, and the United States as its most significant supporter, was failing to enforce the post-Gulf War resolutions designed to disarm Iraq. End quote.
Past and your written letter. You say the illusion of arms control is more dangerous than arms control at all. A view shared by a significant number of very prominent Americans serving in and out of the Congress. Implication being what we have now is the illusion of arms control, and it's hard to deny that that would be a reasonable characterization. You've also stated, and I quote, that the decision to seek diplomatic alternatives to inspection-driven confrontation with Iraq, end of quote, was one of the reasons why you stepped down. Very clear, precise statement that this notion of inspection-driven confrontations with Iraq was an alternative that was shelved by the Security Council, shelved by the United States at this moment, and diplomacy was, of course, sought, and obviously you disagree with that, as many, many experts do. And also, although this is not a quote, you have stated that you believe Iraq and Saddam have made a very basic decision, that they can absorb the kind of air power we threw against them the last time, and it's a price worth paying to be able to maintain, at a minimum a modicum, at a maximum a significant portion of their program related to weapons of mass destruction and the ability to use them. The alternative view seems to be, and I'm not getting this from the administration, we'll hear whether this is correct, seems to be that a policy is, the primary policy is to keep sanctions in place, to deny Saddam the billions of dollars that would allow him to really crank up his program, which neither you or I believe he is ever going to abandon as long as he is in place. But that doesn't guarantee, if these sanctions are in place, that the program is going to be curtailed, anything other than curtailed. Doesn't guarantee that we're going to be able to stop it. I think you and I believe, and many of us believe here, as long as Saddam's at the helm, there is no reasonable prospect. You or any other inspector is ever going to be able to guarantee that we have rooted out, root and branch, the entirety of Saddam's program relative to weapons of mass destruction. And you and I both know, and all of us here really know, and it's the thing we have to face, that the only way we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein is we're going to end up having to start it alone, and it's going to require guys like you in uniform to be back on foot in the desert taking taking Saddam down. You know it, and I know it. So I think we should not kid ourselves here. There's stark choices. I happen to agree with your assessment. A, that diplomacy was picked over inspection-driven confrontation. B, that there's an illusion of arms control that cannot guarantee he will have no system of, no weapons of mass destruction. And C, that as long as he's there, he's concluded he can absorb airstrikes. So I think you've done a significant service for this country. A different policy judgment has been made. If we don't like the policy judgment, in my view, from observation has been made by the administration and the Security Council and our allies. If we don't like it, we should step up to the ball and say it. because you've forced us, and I think properly so, to a day of reckoning here about what our policy should be. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and welcome, even without the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense.
According to reports, Ritter was charged in a June 2001 internet sex sting in New York, but that case was dismissed. He had been charged with attempted child endangerment after arranging in an online chatroom to meet what he thought was a 16-year-old girl at a Burger King restaurant. The girl turned out to be an undercover policewoman. Ritter said, quote, "The criminal charge was a smear campaign in response to his criticizing U.S. policy in the Middle East." End quote. Albany, New York. Former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, a harsh critic of the Bush administration's push toward war with Iraq, suggested that recent news reports of his arrest in an internet sex sting in 2001 were part of an attempt to silence him. He said the publicity forced him to cancel a trip to Baghdad, where he said he would have offered an alternative to military action. Quote, "The timing does stink. I was supposed to be on an airplane yesterday to Baghdad," end quote, he said. Quote, "Let's not forget, we're on the verge of a major conflict in which thousands of American lives may be lost, and I was a leading voice of opposition to this." End quote. Quote, "It's a shame that somebody would bring up this old matter, this dismissed matter, and seek to silence me at this time," end quote. He said. Ritter acknowledged his June 2001 arrest in appearances on television on Wednesday night but said he was prohibited from discussing details because the charges were dismissed and the record sealed. Broadcast reports at the time and recent newspaper reports have indicated he was caught in an internet sex sting, something Ritter did not admit. At the time of the arrest, NBC station WNYT-TV of Albany reported that William Scott Ritter Jr., Ritter's full name, was charged with trying to lure a 16-year-old girl to a restaurant. The girl turned out to be an undercover police officer. WNYT broadcast Ritter's mug shot provided by the police but did not make the connection to his role as the chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq during most of the 1990s. He was charged with attempted endangerment of a child, a misdemeanor that carries up to 90 days in jail, according to the Times-Union of Albany. The case was adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, meaning if he stayed out of trouble for 6 months, the charges would disappear and the file be sealed. Quote, "When you dismiss the case and you seal the files, it maintains the presumption of innocence," end quote. Ritter, 41, said in a court TV interview Wednesday. Quote, "So I'm sticking to my ethical and legal obligations not to discuss this case. I wish other people had done that." End quote. When the story initially surfaced Saturday in the Daily Gazette of Schenectady, Ritter told a reporter, quote, "Sorry, you must have the wrong person." End quote. Times-Union, Scott Ritter criminal case costs prosecutor her job. Monday, January 20, 2003 staff report. Colony. The 2001 arrest of former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter came to light late last week when an Albany County Assistant District Attorney was fired over her handling of the case. A judge sealed the case after it was adjourned in contemplation of dismissal. Colony Police on Sunday declined to discuss the case, citing the sealing order. Last week, District Attorney Paul Klein fired Assistant District Attorney Cynthia Pricer for her handling of the case, saying Pricer failed to notify him about a quote sensitive end quote case. Klein said he launched an internal inquiry into the matter after a reporter from the Daily Gazette of Schenectady asked about a case involving Ritter. Quote, "Based on that inquiry, I determined that I should have been apprised of the existence of the case," end quote. Klein told the Times-Union. Quote, I was not, so Cindy Pricer was fired for failure to keep me abreast of what was going on in Colony Court. End quote. Klein declined to discuss Ritter's arrest. At the time, Ritter said Iraq was, quote, winning its bid to retain its prohibited weapons. End quote. But Ritter seemingly has had a change of heart and now speaks out about a U.S. war against Iraq. He claims inspections could keep Hussein in check. In a move that led many to label him a traitor, Ritter on September 8 became the first American to speak to the Iraq National Assembly. He told the Middle East nation that it needed to allow weapons inspectors to return. Tuesday, January 21, 2003. Mike Goodwin, staff writer. Quote, Assistant District Attorney Cynthia Pricer agreed to have the case adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, which means that charges would be dropped if Ritter stayed out of trouble for a period of time. A Colony Town justice sealed the case after the agreement between the prosecutor and defendant was reached. End quote. District Attorney Paul Klein fired Pricer because she did not inform him about a quote, sensitive end quote case in town court, but Klein would not acknowledge that the case involved Ritter. Defense attorney Michael Koenig said adjournment in contemplation of dismissal was not an unusual outcome for someone charged with a Class B misdemeanor, as Ritter was. Ritter, a former Marine, led a weapons inspection team in Iraq in the 1990s after the Gulf War. He has gained international attention in recent months as a critic of a new U.S. war with Iraq. He has been interviewed frequently on radio and television shows, consistently downplaying the threat posed by Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Ritter's days as a leading voice of the opposition to war could be over if his arrest receives national media attention, said Robert Thompson, professor of media and popular culture at Syracuse University. He said the nature of Ritter's arrest would overwhelm any point he might try to make on a talk show. Quote, when you're a talking head, your whole reason for being has got to be the image of anything you represent, end quote. Thompson said. Quote, if the story starts getting to be a big issue, there will be talking heads making their careers on the end of this talking head. End quote. Times Union, Feds obtain Ritter records. Saturday, January 25, 2003. Carol DeMare and Ann Miller staff writers wrote. Quote, while legal experts said it's not unusual for federal prosecutors to go after information contained in state criminal files, the decision to examine Ritter's case is certain to draw criticism from supporters who feel Ritter is being singled out because of his outspoken views against a possible war in Iraq. End quote. He was charged with a Class B misdemeanor, the least serious state crime on the books, for allegedly setting up a sexual rendezvous with a person who he thought was a 16-year-old girl. Ritter was unaware that he was chatting over the internet with an undercover colony investigator posing as a teenage girl. Police were waiting for Ritter when he showed up at a Burger King in Menands to meet the girl. The case was adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, meaning the charges would be dropped and the records sealed if he didn't break the law for a 6-month period. The deal was negotiated between Assistant District Attorney Cynthia Pricer and Defense Attorney Nora Murphy and was approved by Colony Town Justice Peter Crummy. Last week, Albany County District Attorney Paul Klein fired Pricer. Klein has refused to discuss the case other than to say his staff was told to inform him of all sensitive cases. On Friday, Klein was equally tight-lipped about the impending federal probe of Ritter. Quote, I can neither confirm nor deny the veracity of that report, primarily because you're asking me questions about a case that all the parties have acknowledged is sealed, end quote. Klein said. Quote, I can't comment on another law enforcement agency's dealings with a sealed file. End quote. Ritter finally broke his silence Wednesday after days of negative publicity about his arrest, including reports he had tried to meet with a 14-year-old girl 2 months earlier, in April 2001, and was given a warning by Colony Police. On Tuesday night, Ritter canceled a trip to Iraq because of all the publicity surrounding his arrest. He was dismayed that the 2-year-old Colony case was revealed but refused to discuss the particulars. He insisted the case was dismissed and the record technically expunged. Even in cases where state charges have been disposed of, the federal government can decide to prosecute on similar charges provided they are covered under federal law. It would not be double jeopardy, federal and state officials said. A section of the state criminal procedure law dealing with sealed records allows a law enforcement agency to single-handedly, without notifying the defense, make a motion in a superior court to obtain the records if the agency "demonstrates to the satisfaction of the court that justice requires that such records be made available to it." End quote. Now that federal prosecutors in Albany have possession of the records, they must obtain permission from the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington before they can bring a prosecution. A possible federal case against Ritter could include the charge of using the Internet to entice a minor to engage in criminal activity, sources said. Over the last week, former prosecutors have questioned the way the Ritter case was handled. Albany County's Klein, while not discussing the Ritter case, said he would not approve of charges involving the luring of a teenager girl over the Internet to a sexual encounter to be disposed of as a low-level dismissal. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Don Kinsella, who retired last year as head of the Albany office's criminal division and is now an attorney in private practice, feels Ritter may have gotten off easy. Quote, he was allegedly involved in what otherwise would be felony conduct, and it was charged as a Class B misdemeanor and disposed of, and there's no apparent good reason for it, given the seriousness of the alleged conduct, end quote, Kinsella said. For clarification purposes, this is what a contemplation of dismissal is. Links for more information will be in the documentary notes. In some New York City misdemeanor cases, criminal defense attorneys are able to achieve the holy grail of negotiated settlements to keep their clients from pleading guilty to a crime. An adjournment in contemplation of dismissal (ACD) gives a criminal defendant with little or no criminal history the benefit of the court and prosecutor's doubt regarding the charges filed against them. When an ACD happens, a judge agrees to adjourn your case for a period of time, usually 6 months. During that time frame you don't have to do anything except keep from committing any new crimes. In a normal ACD, that means you don't have to pay a fine, admit any guilt, say anything except agree to the ACD. If you follow the requirements of your ACD, once the 6-month or 1-year time period goes by, your case is dismissed and will be sealed by the court, which means the case will not show up on most background and criminal record checks by employers and others. What is an ACD? An ACD isn't a plea, conviction, or admission of wrongdoing. It's also not a period where you're placed on probation. The criminal justice system doesn't distinguish between the dismissal following a not guilty trial verdict and the one after an ACD dismissal. The timing is main difference between the two dismissals. A not guilty verdict after a trial instantly dismisses a criminal case, but with ACDs you have to wait 6 months or a year for dismissal. However, many times it's quicker to receive an ACD dismissal because the preparation leading up to trial and a criminal trial can take even longer. United Press International, Inc. reported. Albany, New York, January 22, 2003, UPI. Headline, Breaking News. Former UN Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter confirmed media reports on Wednesday that he had appeared in an Albany, New York court concerning an arrest in an internet sex sting. Quote, the case was dismissed. Therefore, it never happened, end quote, Ritter told WNYT-TV. Quote, I stood in a court of law, before a judge and an assistant district attorney with my wife at my side, and they dismissed it. I am deeply saddened. Not by anything I've done, though. End quote. Media reports earlier this week about Ritter's arrest in June 2001 have drowned out his comments about a possible war with Iraq. Ritter told WTEN-TV that all the media attention stinks and that the individual who had leaked the arrest was far more guilty than he was. He added that he had a lot of credibility and was the leading voice of opposition to a possible war with Iraq, but that he didn't know if the reports of the arrest would mean he would be silenced. Ritter, a 41-year-old native of Gainesville, Florida, whose full name is William Scott Ritter, Jr., has lived in the Albany suburb of Delmar with his wife and their twin daughters for 2 years. The June 2001 arrest was not William Ritter's first brush with the law. In April 2001, William Ritter attempted to meet someone he thought was a 14-year-old girl he met online but who in reality was an undercover police officer posing as an underage minor. He was met at the meeting place by police officers but released without being charged. A CNN report in 1998 said that Iraqi officials blocked Ritter's team from conducting searches of possible Iraqi weapons sites, claiming he was a spy for the CIA, a charge the United Nations and the United States denied. At the time, the UN Security Council approved a statement deploring the Iraqi move to block Ritter's team, and Clinton said Iraqi officials would not be allowed to decide the makeup of inspection teams. Ritter resigned from the United Nations in 1998 because he felt that Iraq remained insufficiently disarmed and ready to restart its nuclear and biological weapons programs. The 6'4" former Marine subsequently changed his view on Iraq and has become a regular on network and cable news programs criticizing President George W. Bush and calling for his impeachment for putting members of the American military in a war he considers, quote, illegal and based on a foundation of lies. End quote. He says that Iraq's chemical, biological and nuclear weapons program must either accounted for or destroyed. Ritter explained his reasons for his change of heart in the documentary, In Shifting Sands, which he wrote and directed. A wealthy Iraqi-American businessman, Shakir al-Kafaji, reportedly contributed $400,000 towards the 91-minute account of the UN Weapons Inspection Team in Iraq, known as UNSCOM. The former inspector also spoke before the Iraq National Assembly last September urging Iraq to allow weapons inspectors to return. Ritter called the UN weapons inspectors' recent discovery of empty warheads in Iraq an accounting problem and an indication that the weapons inspectors were doing their job. Quote, Iraq should take a more proactive action and send military officers to every ammunition depot and open up every box to ensure this never again happens and give a full accounting, end quote, Ritter said on CNN last Friday. However, Ritter has said that if the inspectors find evidence that Iraq is attempting to procure or manufacture or has manufactured and is hiding an active chemical agent, quote, then we have a right to presume ill intent on the part of Saddam Hussein and hold them to account. End quote. The Guardian reported on 23 January 2003. Ritter cries foul at sex arrest, smear. Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector and an outspoken critic of war in Iraq, yesterday claimed he was the victim of a smear campaign after it emerged that he had been arrested in an internet sex sting in June 2001. Mr. Ritter cancelled a trip to Baghdad on Tuesday and has instead been appearing on talk shows to defend his reputation. In an interview with CNN on Wednesday, he refused to discuss details of the arrest and attempted to shift the focus onto who leaked the story. Quote, the case was dismissed. The file was sealed. Why did this come up now? End quote, he said. Quote, I have no way of knowing why this happened. But the effect is obvious. I was supposed to fly to Baghdad on a personal initiative that could have had great ramifications in regards issues of war and peace. End quote. The New York Post said Mr. Ritter had been caught in a similar case involving a 14-year-old girl in April 2001 but was not charged. Mr. Ritter, a former U.S. Marine, spent 7 years as a UN weapons inspector, quitting in 1998. He has since become a thorn in the side of the Bush administration, which he accuses of warmongering. Ritter's book was released July 1, 2003, Frontier Justice: Weapons of Mass Destruction and the Bushwhacking of America. During this time period there were a number of predators convicted due to perverted-justice.com sex sting operations. Here is a little more about them. Back when we started in 2003, there was no Twitter, no Facebook, and Google wasn't much more than a search engine. Amazon was mostly known for selling books, even without social networking. Most socializing online when we started up happened in large chat rooms on the networks of the major players at the time. MSN chats, AOL chats and Yahoo chats. Thusly, we set ourselves up to put decoy profiles into those chats, mostly focusing on regional chat rooms to deal with the issue of adults preying on minors online. When we started, there were few laws on the books across the country against trying to solicit a child online. We even wrote the majority of one law and testified in front of a few state legislatures to get them to catch up to the Internet era. With our early work doing stings with local media, the issue came to national prominence. That culminated in NBC's To Catch a Predator series, where millions upon millions became aware of the widespread problem of adults attempting to sexually assault minors they met online. That work led to hundreds of convictions and laws across the country being enacted to deal with this issue. Meanwhile, the element we were inspired to work, chat rooms, all died off. Some due to the fact that the attention and trouble caused by the media exposure of Internet predators had made them unattractive to continue operating. Others died off later on as social networking made them obsolete. Few remnants of the chat room era of the Internet still exist at this point. As the Internet changed, elements like Twitter and social networking in general has spread the problem wide and thin. Internet predators are no longer confined to mostly a few deep wells as they were when we started up. Internet access for younger generations is ubiquitous. They're connected at an earlier age each year with technology in their hands that far exceed the power of PCs we used when starting this website long ago. FAQ from Perverted Justice. Question. How is this a crime? There was no actual minor. Answer. Let's put it in terms we can all agree with. If I go to what I think is a hitman to order a murder of my wife, I've committed a crime. Even if that hitman is an undercover person posing as one for the purposes of catching people conspiring to murder. No one on this planet says, well, hey, how could there be a crime? There was no actual hitman. If a defense attorney tried that tactic in court to defend someone who solicited for the murder of another person, he would be laughed out of the room. So why would anyone believe there needs to be an actual minor when it comes to solicitation? All that needs to exist is the record that the solicitor was informed that the person was a minor and had the intent to have sex with that minor. Just as the charge is the same for a person conspiring to murder with a fake, or real, hitman, the charge is philosophically the same for conspiring to have sex with a fake, or real, minor. Question. Is it entrapment? Answer. Entrapment is a situation where you go out of your way to entice a citizen as law enforcement to commit a crime they otherwise would not commit. For example, if a department sent around female police pretending to be prostitutes to knock on the doors of private citizens offering sex, that's entrapment. We don't do the figurative knocking on doors. Rather we sit, wait, and allow them to knock upon our online door. And when they do, they're in for a surprise. As the law states regarding entrapment, the defense fails when it can be shown that the person being charged had a predisposition to the crime in question. Anyone who knows the law will never make the entrapment argument towards these crimes, because people who know the law understand that these people are predisposed to commit these crimes. It's why they hit us up to begin with. Hundreds upon hundreds of convictions. 0 successful entrapment defenses. 0. Question. What if someone really is just role-playing with a person whom they don't believe is a kid? Answer. It can be amusing to see how far people will go to claim that, as we have already had an individual pled innocent to his chat log based on the role-play defense. Took the jury less than 5 hours to find him guilty. It's a stupid defense and people see through it. For more information on this you can visit the website perverted-justice.com. Because of the success, TV shows started also focusing on sex stings in this new era of online chat rooms, and To Catch a Predator became a popular show. To Catch a Predator is an American reality television series that features hidden camera investigations by the television news magazine program Dateline NBC. It was devoted to impersonating underage people and detaining male adults who contacted them over the internet for sexual liaisons. People were lured to meet with a decoy under the pretense of sexual contact and then confronted. Show host Chris Hansen clarified in an interview with NPR News that these subjects should be labeled as potential sexual predators, and not pedophiles. Pedophiles have a very specific definition, people who are interested in prepubescent sex, he stated. The series premiered in November 2004, and featured 12 investigations in total held across the United States. The investigations were conducted as undercover sting operations with the help of online watchdog group Perverted Justice. Since the third installment, law enforcement and other officials were also involved, leading to the arrests of most individuals caught. No new episodes have aired since December 2007. NBC affiliates WTMJ in Milwaukee, KSHB in Kansas City and WBRE have also done local versions of To Catch a Predator. Various spin-offs have aired in the same format, including To Catch a Con Man, To Catch an ID Thief, To Catch a Car Thief and To Catch an Hijacker, which featured iPod thieves. To Catch a Predator is also aired on FX and Crime and Investigation Network in the United Kingdom, the Crime and Investigation Network in Australia and New Zealand and Fox Crime in Portugal. The show was eventually cancelled in 2008. A former chief United Nations weapons inspector is accused of contacting what he thought was a 15-year-old girl in an internet chat room, engaging in a sexual conversation and showing himself masturbating on a web camera.
Don't know. There's a lot you don't know. First of all, the incident in question was in an adults-only chat room.
Yep.
An adults-only chat room where the person that had to go in had to make a profile that said they were over 18. And then on 3 occasions had to confirm that they were over 18 before they were allowed to interact. If 2 people meet and they both agree at the start that they're over 18, anything that happens after that
is consensual.
Ain't a crime.
On a February afternoon in 2009, Ryan Veneman, one of only 5 full-time police officers in tiny Barrett Township, PA, decided to spend some time hunting for sexual predators online. Veneman entered a Yahoo chat room, where the minimum legal age is supposed to be 18, and passed himself off as a teenager named Emily. Before long, he was contacted by a man who said he was 44 and called himself Delmarm 4 Fun, a reference to Delmar, NY, an Albany suburb about 3 hours from where Veneman was sitting in the Poconos. Age? Delmarm 4 Fun asked. 15. Aha, came the response. New York or PA? A graphic flirtation ensued. At one point, Delmarm 4 Fun asked Emily again if she was 18. No, I'm 15, Veneman replied. Aha, Delmarm 4 Fun said again. My bad. What's wrong? Veneman asked. Didn't realize you were 15. So why you don't like me? Veneman typed, mimicking an adolescent's mangled syntax. I do, very much. Law. Just don't want any trouble. After about an hour of this, according to logs later presented in court, the man Veneman was talking to masturbated in front of a webcam and announced he was off to take a shower. You know in a lot of trouble, don't you? Veneman typed. Huh? I'm a undercover police officer. You need to call me ASAP. Nah, Delmarm 4 Fun wrote. You're not 15. Yahoo is for 18 and over. It's all fantasy. No crime. I have your phone number and I will be getting your IP address from Yahoo and your carrier, Veneman wrote. We can do this 2 ways, call me and you can turn yourself in at a later date or I'll get a warrant for you and come pick you up. The perpetrator turned himself in almost immediately. Delmarm 4 Fun, it turned out, was Scott Ritter, one of the most controversial figures in American foreign policy for the past decade and a half. In a bizarre moment in 2002, Ritter even made the long journey back to Baghdad to address the Iraqi parliament as a private citizen, warning that his own country was about to make a historical mistake, and urging the Iraqis to allow inspections to resume. For this, and for his relentless insistence that the presence of hidden WMDs was nothing but a political pretense for war, Ritter was dismissed and even mocked by much of the media establishment, including writers for this magazine and the New York Times. In Ritter's case, the public vindication to which he would seem entitled, and which he has never quite received, has now been replaced by a very public disgrace, his life having slowly come undone in the years after the invasion. Even after he was convicted on 5 felony counts and 2 misdemeanors last year, Ritter remained, as he always has, self-righteous and inclined toward seeing conspiracies. Quote, "I'm not humiliated," quote, he told me recently, when I suggested he should be. Quote, "It's nobody else's business. And anybody who seeks to make it their business, they should be humiliated. They should be ashamed. They should be embarrassed. What I did or what I didn't do is nobody's business but my own and my wife's. And the fact that this had been dragged out into the public eye the way it has speaks volumes about our society." End quote. Those who came to Ritter's defense around Iraq always argued that he was a courageous and patriotic American, unjustly defamed by opponents, while his critics portrayed him as unreliable and attention-starved, and quote, unstable quote character, as Richard Pearl, one of the administration's war planners, once described him. The confounding thing about a figure as self-defeating and polarizing as Scott Ritter is that, with enough time, supporters and critics alike can come to feel they've been proved right. Quote, "I'll tell you why it doesn't matter," quote, Ritter was saying. This was in October, a few weeks before he was to be sentenced for his crimes. I had asked him whether he thought he deserved some public acknowledgement that his warnings about Iraq and its supposed WMDs were correct. Quote, "Because today everybody knows I was right. I was the only one who was right about one of the most significant issues in modern American history." End quote. Quote, and yet, quote, Ritter went on, quote, "The common reaction seems to be, well, that was then, this is now. Yeah, he was right back then, but how does that impact us today, 10 years later?" Quote, he shook his head in disbelief. Ritter is an uncommonly articulate man, and when he gets going, the indignation flows in fully formed paragraphs. Quote, "What is the relevance of being right 10 years ago? I don't know, talk about all the dead Americans. It's relevant to their families, I would think. Talk about the tens of thousands of wounded Americans and the hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded Iraqis." End quote. Quote, "Everybody who lied about the war got rewarded," quote, Ritter said. Quote, "Because they played the game. Tell the truth about the war, you don't get rewarded." Quote, he paused. Quote, "And then, let's be frank, you compound it with me shooting myself in the foot on personal, behavioral issues." End quote. An awkward moment passed between us. Quote, "I'll just ask the fundamental question," quote, Ritter said, looking at me squarely across the table. Quote, "My personal missteps, how many Americans have died as a result of that? None. Other than my family, how many victims were there? None. And yet, in refusing to engage in a responsible debate about Iraq, how many Americans died? Thousands. And America seems to have no problem with that." End quote. The article continues on, quote, "The drive to neutralize Scott Ritter finally climaxed in a murky but effective charge of something like attempted pedophilia, stealthily exposed in January 2003. That slander was, to say the least, gratuitous. Quote. End quote. Except that it wasn't slander, inasmuch as slander is, by definition, untrue. In fact, the police in Colony, NY, encountered Ritter twice in 2001, and quietly arrested him once, after he contacted cops posing as underage girls in chat rooms. Ritter was caught using the unsubtle screen name on exhibit. In both cases, Ritter agreed to meet the fictional teenagers in the parking lots of fast food joints, with the intent of masturbating in front of them, only to be confronted by cops when he got there. For reasons that still aren't entirely clear, the prosecutor dismissed the charges, on the condition that Ritter enter intensive counseling, and a local judge sealed the records. The timing of the revelations about Ritter's 2-year-old arrests, which somehow became public just as the administration was preparing to invade Iraq, certainly seemed to indicate that his political adversaries meant to destroy his credibility. In the hours left to himself, though, Ritter struggled. According to court testimony, by 2004, when he stopped attending therapy, Ritter had made an almost daily habit of trying to meet adult women from the chat rooms, in cars or out-of-the-way places, so they could watch him masturbate. Ritter maintains that he never engaged with an actual minor online, and there's no evidence to suggest he did, beyond his interactions with undercover police officers in chat rooms for over 18-year-olds. In 2007, he started using the webcam instead. He admits he couldn't stop. Quote, "I always sort of chuckle when people say, 'What were you thinking?' Quote, Ritter told me. Quote, 'Well, what part of depressed don't you understand? Find me someone who says depressed people engage in coherent thought.'" End quote. It's tempting to try to find some deeper connection between Ritter's public crusade and his most private transgressions. Does he simply crave attention wherever he can get it? Does he need to feel admired? Quote, "I'm someone who believes the truth needs to be heard," end quote, Ritter told me. Quote, "And if I'm empowered with the truth, I'm not going to shut up." End quote. Such stridency has repercussions. Taken in isolation, this latest case against Ritter, the one in Pennsylvania stemming from Ryan Veneman's sting, is hardly the kind of thing that lands you on, quote, "America's Most Wanted." Quote, "It's not as though Ritter, who is the father of twin 19-year-old daughters, was trolling an adolescent site looking to prey on minors. Nor did he ever hint at meeting with the fictional Emily face to face. There's little question the man needs help, but such cases are routinely disposed of through plea bargains, and prosecutors in Ritter's case were willing, initially, to let him escape with a single guilty plea, which may well have meant probation rather than jail. Especially given Ritter's previous arrests in New York, this seems to have been a more than equitable resolution, and most accused sex offenders in the age of Megan's Law would probably have jumped at it. But Ritter has forcefully insisted all along that he did nothing wrong, beyond betraying Marina's trust. Quote, "Why would I plead guilty to something I didn't do?" Quote, "He asked me, when I raised the issue of a plea arrangement. I suggested he might have done it to avoid going to jail. Quote, no, quote, he replied. Quote, wrong answer. Then I'm not a man. Then I'm not a human being. Quote." At trial, Ritter told the jury that he assumed Veneman was a housewife pretending to be 15, and that he had never for a moment believed he was talking to a minor, despite the fact that Emily repeatedly stated her age. When prosecutors were successful in moving to unseal his New York files and presented evidence from those arrests too, Ritter steadfastly maintained that he was aware, in both instances, that he was talking to undercover cops. He knew his online activities needed to be stopped, Ritter said, so he arranged to meet the officers involved, playing along with the notion that they were teenage girls, so that he could get himself arrested and be forced to face his demons. This would have been a more persuasive defense, perhaps, had one of the arresting detectives not testified that Ritter, upon seeing the police lying in wait for him, tried to evade capture by slamming down the gas pedal and jumping a curb, T.J. Hooker style. Ritter's refusal to surrender to the system, to even admit there could be any reasonable interpretation of the facts other than his own, seemed to enrage the prosecutor and the judge in Monroe County. I think his arrogance and his refusal to admit any wrongdoing definitely hurt him at trial, the prosecutor, Michael Rokoczewski, told me recently, likening Ritter to an alcoholic or a drug addict. Quote, if that person is in denial about the root issue of the problem or the extent of the problem, I don't see how that person can get effective treatment. They're still liable to reoffend. End quote. And so you could say that the very attribute that made Scott Ritter appear somehow clairvoyant on Iraq, his refusal to accede to everyone else's sense of reality, is the same one that has led him, now, to ruin. He lost his only steady job in years, writing analyses on world events for a private energy firm, when the charges became public. After years of picnics and camaraderie, his fellow firefighters removed him from active duty before he could even be tried in court. Quote, "These guys knew me better than any of my military friends knew me," quote, Ritter told me. Quote, "To have them turn on me that quickly, quote, he snapped his fingers, quote, yeah, it was one of the most profound disappointments I have experienced. Quote, I asked him if the prospect of being incarcerated frightened him. Quote, jail doesn't scare me, quote, Ritter said. Quote, not being there for my family scares me. Jail is something guilty people fear. I'm not guilty. Quote, in the days leading up to Ritter's sentencing in the last week of October, a significant development suddenly brought him new hope. Responding to an appeal from Ritter's lawyers, a panel of appellate judges in New York ruled unanimously that the files from his 2001 arrest should never have been unsealed and used in his trial. This presented a legal quandary between two neighboring states. The records from Ritter's arrests in New York were now under seal once again, but in the meantime they had been instrumental in convicting Ritter in Pennsylvania. His lawyers, Gary Coleman, a white-collar trial lawyer in Washington, and Todd Henry, a Philadelphia-based specialist in sex crimes, filed a motion asking the judge in Pennsylvania to throw out the conviction. On the morning of Ritter's scheduled sentencing, he and Marina and the lawyers arrived back at the courthouse in Stroudsburg, PA, and proceeded into a drab basement room to hear the ruling on their motion. Coleman argued his case for vacating the verdict, but the judge, Jennifer Harlacher Sibum, was clearly unmoved, as she had been by most of Ritter's arguments during the trial. She acknowledged that the legal issues raised by the simultaneous decisions in two separate states were unusual. Quote, I don't know that it's ever been confronted in Pennsylvania, quote, she said at one point, but decided to proceed with sentencing anyway. Ritter was seated at the defense table, about 4 feet in front of me, wearing a dark gray suit with a white shirt and a red tie. He sat expressionless, locking and unlocking his fingers and occasionally pressing them against his closed eyes. Behind me, in the second and last row of benches for spectators, sat a few of Ritter's old military buddies from his days as a weapons inspector, and next to them a gaunt-faced Marina. After hearing testimony from dueling psychologists, Judge Sibum decided that Ritter met the state standard for being classified as a violent predator, despite having never displayed a sexually violent tendency. This meant that he would have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. Then it was the defendant's turn to address the court and ask for leniency. Ritter rose from his chair and took a long moment to compose himself, the uncomfortable silence broken only by Marina's voice. Quote, hold your head up high, Scott, quote, she called out. Quote, I stand before you about as chastened as an adult man can be, quote, Ritter told the judge in a commanding voice. Quote, as a husband, as a father, I had no business doing what I was doing. Quote, I heard a woman's anguished sniffling behind me. But even in his determination to show humility, Ritter couldn't help flashing defiance. Quote, it should never have been made public, quote, he loudly told the court, motioning back toward Marina. Quote, it's between me and my wife. Quote, you could see, in the hardening of Judge Sibum's eyes, how his adamancy exasperated her. Richard Butler and Norman Schwarzkopf would no doubt have sympathized. Quote, I have paid a horrible price, quote, Ritter went on. Quote, no one to blame, only myself. I went from being someone who stood tall in my community, who assisted my community, to someone who's been cast aside. End quote. Then it was the judge's turn. Quote, I do acknowledge that Mr. Ritter has had tremendous service and has made many contributions to his community and this country, end quote, Sibum said. She added, however, that, quote, he has made excuses for his conduct in this case, quote, specifically noting what he had just said about the whole thing being a matter for him and his wife. Quote, it supports the conclusion, quote, she said, quote, that Mr. Ritter fails to take responsibility. He believes he was entrapped. Quote. She read off the 7 counts and their corresponding prison terms. They amounted to a minimum of 18 months and a maximum of 5.5 years in a state facility. Coleman immediately urged the judge to set some kind of bail, pending appeal, but she shook her head and ordered the 3 sheriffs standing nearby to take Ritter into custody. There was the sound of handcuffs clicking, followed by another sob from the back of the room. Ritter looked impassively at Marina and nodded once as the sheriffs turned him around and marched him down a short hallway and through a locked door, silenced at last.
Tonight, shocking and revolting behavior allegedly caught on a webcam. The former chief weapons inspector for the United Nations busted in a child sex sting. The allegations are downright horrifying. Scott Ritter accused of pleasuring himself on camera for what he thought was a 15-year-old girl. He's a father, a husband, and a former Marine. And this isn't the first time he's faced this kind of controversy. Issues starts now. The former chief weapons inspector for the United Nations busted in a child sex sting. Scott Ritter was a highly respected UN official who became famous arguing, correctly as it turns out, that there were no WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, in Iraq. Now he is at the center of a completely different storm. Tonight, he is an accused child predator. Detectives say Ritter was trolling chat rooms looking for cyber sex with teenage girls. He allegedly started chatting up a girl named Emily. Cops say he then turned on his webcam and sent her explicit videos of himself allegedly masturbating on camera, even after she told him, "I'm just 15. Cops say what Ritter didn't know was that Emily was really an undercover detective.
Wondering if we can talk to you about some charges that have been alleged against you?
No, I'm sorry. There'll be no comment.
Is there any statement you'd like to make at all?
No, ma'am.
Ritter is the father of 2 teenage daughters. Now, straight out to my fantastic expert panel. Former criminal investigator Steve Cardian. Psychologist Brenda Wade, we need you tonight, my dear. Criminal defense attorney Mark Eiglarsh and investigative reporter Michelle Sagona of michellesagona.com. But we begin with New York Daily News reporter Bill Hutchinson. Bill, dare we ask, what is the very latest?
Well, the very latest is that Mr. Ritter has been charged with felony counts that could carry 7 years in prison if he's convicted. And what we understand that this occurred back in February in a small town in Pennsylvania called Barrett Township, where police were doing an undercover investigation into these cyber predators trolling for young girls.
Do you ever go into an internet chat room looking for teenage girls to have a sexual encounter of any sort with? How about that?
Aaron, I will respond the same way, this way till Sunday. I was arrested in June 2001, charged with a Class B misdemeanor. I stood before a judge and the case was dismissed. The file was sealed, and I certainly wish you and everyone else would respect that.
That case was dismissed.
But I do want to mention that this starts at home. This is not obviously your unemployed person sitting in their basement that is, trolling these sites to prey on children. These are obviously educated people that are going out and targeting kids, and that's why parents need to be aware of what their children are doing and to be able to educate them on the steps and the signs if they are going to be in these chats.
Yeah. Jane, you talk about, addictions, and this type of an addiction is it's an unquenchable thirst. These guys, they look at, it's like they hadn't eaten in 2 days and there's a steak in front of them. They get this urge. It's uncontrollable.
Well,
having a computer
steak in my case. Go ahead.
Having a computer in his house is like having a bar in an alcoholic's basement. It's something he's going to go to, he's going to go back to, and he's going to repeat, and they do come from all walks of life.
And again, he has not been convicted of anything.
Yes.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Brenda Wade, psychologist. We need you.
This is exactly, Jane, you know this. This is exactly the definition of addiction. Someone who can't stop performing compulsive behavior. They feel absolutely compelled, no matter the risk to themselves, the harm to the child that they're interacting with. Absolutely,
America
Jane.
has to reconsider its perception of what predators look like. The hit show, To Catch a Predator, aired on NBC, and it caught all types of guys in the act. Take a look.
Sir, please don't destroy my career. What do you do for a living? Finishing up in the military.
Also among the more memorable visitors, these 2 men who walked into our home naked.
What are you doing? Making a mistake.
Host Chris Hansen even caught a rabbi hoping to meet a 13-year-old boy. Our image of a predator, Michelle Sagona, you've done so much work on this, simply does not reflect the reality that it's often the average middle class and, yes, married man. The stats show 1 in 5 children 10 to 17 years of age get unwanted sexual solicitations online. Isn't this part of the larger problem? And I'll go to Steve Cardian because you did an undercover investigation into problems involving women at bars, but all of this stuff is interconnected.
Yes, it is.
It's very much interconnected, Jane. It's all a part of what is the bigger problem and the bigger picture in the United States today and across the world with human trafficking, with the internet and our computer age that allows these predators to spread their tentacles, if you will, and prey upon our young. So you're exactly right.
Mark Eiglar's final word is, does he have any defense? I mean, could he say, hey, I was doing this, but I wasn't directing it at XYZ?
He can say that. It's not going to prevail. 2 words, plea bargain. Probably that's what we're going to see in this case. He'll spare his family any further embarrassment and get the lowest possible sentence that he can get.
All right.
Post Staff Report. January 14, 2010. According to the affidavit, the cop said he was a 15-year-old named, quote, Emily, quote. Quote, Emily, quote, told Ritter she was from the Poconos, at which point Ritter asked for a picture other than the one, quote, she, quote, had posted on her account. Police said that's when Ritter then sent her a link to his web camera and began to masturbate. Quote, Emily, quote, asked Ritter for his cell phone number, which he gave her during the February 2009 conversation. Ritter again asked, quote, Emily, quote, how old she was. Told, quote, she, quote, was 15. Ritter said he didn't realize she was a minor and abruptly turned off his cam, saying he didn't want to get in trouble. Ritter then told, quote, Emily, quote, he had been fantasizing about having sex with her, to which she replied, quote, guess you turned it off. Quote. That's when Ritter replied, quote, you want to see it finish, end quote, turning his webcam back on until he ejaculated, police said. The probe lasted until the fall when Ritter was arrested last November 9 and charged with unlawful contact with a minor, criminal use of a communications facility, corruption of minors, indecent exposure, possessing instruments of crime, criminal attempt and criminal solicitation, authorities said. Klein was so, quote, shocked and angered, quote, that he hadn't been told about the case. He canned Cynthia Pricer, the assistant DA who had handled it. Ritter, who is awaiting trial, waived his right last month to a preliminary hearing and is currently free on $25,000 bail. Ritter's sex charges from 2001 unsealed. Judge finds prior bad acts can be used as evidence at his trial. By Brendan J. Lyons, senior writer. Published, 12 a.m., Monday, December 27, 2010. Quote, you know you're in a lot of trouble, don't you? Quote, Veneman typed in a Yahoo chatroom message. Quote, I am a undercover police officer, you need to call me ASAP. Quote. Quote, nah. Quote, Ritter answered. Quote, you're not 15. Yahoo is for 18 and over. It's all fantasy. No crime. ... As far as I know, you're a 56-year-old housewife. End quote. The problem for Ritter, 49, a volunteer fireman and married father of 2 daughters, is that the encounter with Veneman is at least the 3rd time he's been snared in an internet sting case involving police posing as minors. Now, the past is coming back to haunt Ritter. A Pennsylvania judge ruled last week that 2 Colony case files involving Ritter be unsealed so they can be used as evidence against him at his upcoming trial. Several months later, an Albany County prosecutor agreed to classify Ritter's case as an, quote, adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, quote, ACOD, an outcome in New York State's criminal law in which a prosecutor agrees to excuse a defendant's behavior in exchange for 6 months to 1 year of good behavior. After that time, the case is legally dismissed and the records are sealed from the public as though the incident never occurred. With an ACOD, a defendant becomes legally allowed to deny the arrest occurred, except in special circumstances, such as applying for a job as a police officer or a teacher. In Ritter's case, his prosecutor was later fired for her decision.
The prosecutor here, she knows who she is. She was pulling out all the stops to get me a level 3 assignment. At the end of the day, the judge decided on and what the judge basically said is the entire case is flawed.
Which it was.
There's no case here. But because New York can't overturn a Pennsylvania conviction, the conviction stands, but it's going to be a level 1, the lowest level, low-level offender, no risk to society.
And so for me to understand what you say, all these years later, you're still appealing, but you're appealing in the state of Pennsylvania, correct?
Still in the in Pennsylvania. Yep. No, I just got my
oh, looky there.
This is my initial response from the Superior Court, and they have remanded because I challenged the lower court's decision. They've remanded it back to lower court, saying that I have a case. So all you haters out there, I'm not going to say it, but you know what I want to say. Wait, watch this space. But
Scott's going to get the last laugh. Be careful, folks.
Well, I don't know. Look, don't count your chickens before you hatch.
That's true.
Ritter's charges in Pennsylvania are more serious. He is free on $25,000 bail and charged with 5 felonies, including unlawful contact with a minor, which carries a potential prison sentence of up to 7 years. Prosecutors in Pennsylvania argued in pretrial motions to unseal Ritter's colony arrest records because the past encounters are evidence that Ritter knew what he was doing was a crime, and not fantasy. Quote, all 3 involve minors, all 3 involve females, all 3 involve communications over the internet, all 3 involved undercover police, and all 3 involved the defendant's desire to masturbate in the presence of a minor while she watched him. Quote, said Michael Rokoczewski, a Monroe County Assistant District Attorney, in a motion to the court. Quote, the prior bad acts demonstrate the defendant's motive, quote, Rokoczewski added. Quote, the defendant may claim he did not believe the victim was a minor and never intended to expose himself to a minor. However, the fact that he did so twice before would negate this defense. End quote. The judge agreed, ruling that Ritter's alleged, quote, prior bad acts, quote, may be used as evidence against him at his trial set to begin March 8. The 2001 arrest of Ritter had remained secret until 2003, when details of the incident were leaked to a newspaper. Pocono record. Jury selection opens in sex case against former UN official. Jury selection will begin today in Monroe County Court for an April trial of former United Nations official William Scott Ritter, Jr., who is charged with contacting what he thought was a 15-year-old girl in an internet chat room and started a conversation of a sexual nature. At a hearing in Monroe County last year, Philadelphia attorney Todd Henry, who is defending the case against Monroe County Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski, asked why Veneman was posing as a minor in a chat room that was supposed to be exclusively for adults. Whatever chat room Veneman was in doesn't change the fact that Ritter still engaged in a sexual conversation with what he believed at the time to be a minor, the prosecution maintains.
This type of crime crosses all different lines, and it's not maybe the typical person you would think who would engage in this type of behavior. So as a message to parents in general, you have to be very careful with children who they talk to over the internet, because obviously it could, nowadays it's different. It's not just a person maybe hanging out at the park, it's over the internet. It could be anybody. This goes to show that, again, it crosses all different lines and it could be anybody. And also, in this prosecution, it goes to show that nobody is above the law. Again, it's a pending case, we can't comment on the evidence, but in the affidavit of probable cause, which is a matter of public record, there is a statement in there basically that the individual did indicate that he was fantasizing about having sex with this underage minor while he was apparently performing a sex act on himself. The charge in this case is unlawful contact with a minor to commit a sex offense. And that charge actually was specifically written for these types of offenses. And actually, right in the statutory language, it also says also an undercover officer or law enforcement officer posing as a minor or who has assumed the identity of a minor. In this case, that's a felony 3, the highest. Well, that's the felony 3 grading, and he can face up to 7 years in prison if convicted or if he pleads guilty. In this case, the police are being proactive, whereby they're trying to avoid having actual minors victimized by these types of predators and these types of people. We do fully intend on going forward with these charges, and we're not going to dismiss the charges or drop them, or it's not appropriate to allow him to plead to, in Pennsylvania we have what's called ARD, which is accelerated rehabilitative disposition for first-time offenders. In this case, he doesn't really meet that qualification because he's allegedly not really a first-time offender, but that's also not appropriate for this type of charge. So basically, he's either going to plead guilty or will go to trial, and then the case will resolve itself as it resolves itself.
Pocono record. Jury selection opens in sex case against former UN official. Staff writer Pocono record March 8, 2011. Jury selection will begin today in Monroe County Court for an April trial of former United Nations official William Scott Ritter, Jr., who is charged with contacting what he thought was a 15-year-old girl in an internet chat room and started a conversation of a sexual nature. At a hearing in Monroe County last year, Philadelphia attorney Todd Henry, who is defending the case against Monroe County Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski, asked why Veneman was posing as a minor in a chat room that was supposed to be exclusively for adults. Whatever chat room Veneman was in doesn't change the fact that Ritter still engaged in a sexual conversation with what he believed at the time to be a minor, the prosecution maintains. Quoted directly from the trial transcripts. Prosecutor. Quote, so you're saying that in February of 2007 you must be back in this dark place again that you were in 2001, right? Quote. Ritter. Quote, not as severe, but, yes, I was. Quote. Prosecutor. Quote, and you were back doing the same thing in regard to masturbating and so forth over the internet, right? Quote. Ritter. Quote, yes, sir. Quote. Prosecutor. Quote, and, obviously, that's a problem, correct? Quote. Ritter. Quote, yes, sir. Quote. Prosecutor. Quote, you tried the best you could to contain it but you couldn't contain it, right? Quote. Ritter. Quote, yes, sir. Quote. Prosecutor. Quote, just one thing. Going back to 2001. You actually told Tom Breslin that you needed help because your problem progressed to the point where you wanted to meet underage girls. Quote.
Point where literally you're too proud to turn for anybody for help, and then I'm going to put you on the internet and I'm going to see what you do. All right. I'm not saying everybody behaves the same. I will tell you that I engaged in no criminal activity, none whatsoever. Never have, never will. But what I did on the internet is not something that people should be proud of. It's especially if you're married. I'll be the first one to say that. But it wasn't criminal. And if anybody's going to hold to me account, it's going to be my wife, who, by the way, has forgiven me. We've been married 31 years. I have twin daughters. They have no problem with it. My friends who were where they're all good. So all the people closest to me understand what happened, understand it wasn't criminal, and understand that I was at the lowest possible moment in my entire life.
Yes, you were.
And if, again, like I said, I'm not going to get into the details because it's none of your business.
The record by Michael Rubinkam. Published, April 13, 2011. Ex-UN Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter takes stand in sex case. Ritter takes the stand. Arrested in an online sex sting, insisted Wednesday that he believed he was trading sexually explicit messages with an adult, not an underage girl, and rejected prosecutors' claims that he has a history of trying to pick up minors over the internet. Scott Ritter, 49, of Delmar, took the witness stand in his own defense and testified that he believed the person he met in a Yahoo chat room in February 2009 was an adult who was acting out her own sexual fantasy of being a minor involved with an older man. Quote, "Did you go into an adult chat room with the intent of having an inappropriate conversation with a minor?" Quote asked his attorney, Gary Coleman. Quote, "No, sir," quote Ritter said. Ritter, who is married with 18-year-old twin daughters, called his behavior quote, "inappropriate" and "shameful," but said it was not criminal. "At no time did I believe I was dealing with a 15-year-old, he said. One adult is fantasizing about being an age they're not. Monroe County Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski was incredulous. Quote, "Are you serious?" Quote he asked, bringing a swift objection from Ritter's attorney. On cross-examination, Rokoczewski confronted Ritter with his 2001 arrest in New York on similar charges. The charges were eventually dismissed and the case was sealed, but prosecutors are using it to try to show Ritter has a predilection for underage girls. Rokoczewski also pointed to transcripts of the 2001 and 2009 chats that seemed to indicate Ritter's belief that he was engaging in sexually explicit talk and behavior with minors. Quote, "You can never tell anyone you did this," quote Ritter said, according to a transcript of one of the 2001 chats. At the beginning of the 2009 chat, an undercover officer typed to Ritter, quote, "If you like younger, I'm fine." Quote Ritter told jurors he knew he was chatting with undercover police and set up the meetings so he would be arrested. Quote, "I was severely depressed. My life was unraveling around me," end quote he said. Ritter is charged with unlawful contact with a minor and other counts in the Pennsylvania case. Closing arguments were set for today. Jury in Ritter's sex sting case takes dinner break, deliberations to continue. Staff writer Pocono Record April 14, 2011. Quote, "That was his fetish. He's an exhibitionist. That's what he is," quote Monroe County Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski said Thursday in his closing argument. Rokoczewski pointed out that Ritter briefly turned off the camera at one point and typed that he didn't want any trouble, then turned it back on and completed the act. Quote, "He knows he's doing something wrong. He knows he's doing something he shouldn't be doing," quote Rokoczewski said. His attorney, Gary Coleman, acknowledged in his closing argument that jurors were likely quote, "troubled and offended," quote by the graphic chat and video of Ritter that prosecutors played, but said they were required to put aside their personal distaste because quote, "This is not a referendum on whether anybody in the courtroom approves of adult chat rooms." Quote, "Mr. Ritter makes clear as a bell that as far as he is concerned, he was dealing with an adult and it was a fantasy," quote Coleman said. Pocono Record. Andrew Scott on April 15, 2011. Former UN weapons inspector Ritter guilty on all but one charge in sexting. Emily sent Ritter photos of herself at his request. She then told Ritter her 26-year-old ex-boyfriend had taken photos of other girls her age having sex. Ritter then asked, 18? During testimony, when Coleman asked what Ritter meant by 18, Ritter said he was asking Emily if the girls having sex in the photos were 18 because he didn't want her sending him any child pornography. But when cross-examined, Ritter contradicted himself by saying, "I wanted to confirm I was talking to an adult." When Emily told Ritter, "No, I'm 15, Ritter said, my bad. I didn't know you were 15. Ritter, who testified to not really believing Emily was 15, then continued talking to her and later sent her webcam images of himself masturbating. But that wasn't the first time during the conversation that Emily told him she was 15, Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski said in his closing argument. She told him this at the start of the conversation. And when she did, instead of him ending the conversation right there, he said, "Okay," and continued. Ritter said his controversial 1998 resignation from the UN drove him into a self-destructive depression that led him to spend more time in adult chat rooms. His screen name at the time was on exhibit, since his sexual fantasy was women watching him masturbate. Ritter said he knew the 14-year-old girl he met online in April 2001 and the 16-year-old girl he met there 2 months later were both Colony, NY, police posing undercover. He said he pretended to believe they were real minors and that he told both he would drive somewhere to meet and masturbate in front of them in a vehicle. He said he felt getting arrested by police was the only way to finally get help for the root of his problems. Why go to such lengths instead of just seeking professional counseling? Rokoczewski asked the jury. Police did not arrest Ritter when he went to meet the first girl, but told him they would arrest him the next time. When meeting the second girl online in June 2001, Ritter asked her to call him on his cell phone so he could make sure I'm not being set up, though he testified he knew he was talking to undercover police. A female undercover officer called Ritter by phone and told him to meet her in the Burger King parking lot. If he really wanted police to arrest him so he could finally get the help he needed, why did he drive by the Burger King twice before finally pulling into the parking lot? Rokoczewski asked. Why not just immediately pull right in? Because he knew he was breaking the law by going to meet what he believed was a minor he had met online. Because he first wanted to be sure police weren't there to grab him when he pulled in. Rokoczewski cited a former Colony police detective lieutenant's testimony about Ritter trying to drive away when spotting police and being stopped. This isn't the behavior of someone who wants to be arrested, Rokoczewski said. Police dropped the charges against Ritter after he finally got professional help for his depression. We're happy with the verdict, Rokoczewski said afterward, accompanied by Venmo. The jury saw the case for what it was and saw Mr. Ritter for what he is and what he did. I do, however, feel sorry for his family, who had to be put through this. Juror Joe McFalds of Effort said this was a very hard case to listen to and deliberate. The man needs help and I hope he gets it, McFalds said. I feel bad for his wife and children. The jury at one point during deliberation had to ask for clarification on a few issues to help them reach a proper verdict. It just seemed logical, juror Richard Hurley of East Stroudsburg said. Even though the defense attorney did a beautiful job, the prosecution's evidence was so obvious. Hurley said the graphic 30-minute webcam video of Ritter masturbating was a key piece of evidence the jury considered. The video, and the defendant's own words, when you matched them up, it was obvious, Hurley said. Pocono record. Sex offender experts to assess Ritter's case. Andrew Scott, April 16, 2011. Scott Ritter will be assessed by Pennsylvania and New York experts to see if he should be deemed a sexually violent predator. The assessment is part of what will help a judge determine how severe a punishment to impose on Ritter, who faces up to 7 years in prison on the most serious of the charges. A jury Thursday convicted Ritter, 49, of Delmar, NY. The Pennsylvania Sexual Offender Assessment Board, a panel of experts appointed by the State Probation and Parole Department, will evaluate Ritter and his personal and criminal history, looking for any pattern of predatory behavior that warrants him being deemed a sexually violent predator. Ritter will be assessed by a similar expert or experts in New York, where he previously faced similar accusations. Sexually violent predators have to register under that label for a lifetime. Ritter would at minimum have to register as a sex offender, a registration that lasts for 10 years in Pennsylvania. Ritter testified to knowing at the time that the minors were really undercover police. If experts in either Pennsylvania or New York recommend the court deem Ritter a sexually violent predator, a hearing will be scheduled before a judge, who will consider expert testimony and prosecution and defense arguments. Ritter will also undergo a pre-sentencing investigation by the Monroe County Probation Office, likewise standard procedure for convicted defendants, said Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski, who prosecuted Ritter's case. This evaluation will include criminal history and any psychological or psychiatric reviews, with Ritter having the chance to give his own version of the events that led to his conviction. Family and friends will have the chance to write to the judge, offering their opinions of Ritter's character. Reviewing both the pre-sentencing investigation and sexual offender assessments, the judge will also consult state sentencing guidelines. The judge can depart from those guidelines, in which case either the prosecution or defense can raise challenges. Ritter has until the end of the business day Tuesday to come up with $25,000 in bail or be placed in Monroe County Correctional Facility and then have to post that amount to get out. He also has been ordered to avoid online chat rooms. Other details from this case cited from the court memorandum can be found in the links of this documentary here as an example of some of the details that were not covered in the articles. The online conversation was sexual in nature. During the conversation, Ritter provided Emily with a link to his webcam, asking her to share photographs with him. Ritter was particularly interested in whether Emily's ex-boyfriend took any traditional ex-pics of her, by which he meant nude or provocative photographs. In response to Ritter's repeated requests to send additional photos, Emily transmitted a photograph to which Ritter replied, that sick, get a reaction. Ritter then stated that he was waiting for Emily to put up another pic so he can continue to react. The webcam was operational at the time and displayed a man's face and upper body area. When queried as to what he meant by react, Ritter responded that he reacted below the screen, where his hands are, indicating his hands are down lower. Ritter then communicated to Emily that he was having a big reaction here, and asked Emily if she would like to see more. Ritter then adjusted the webcam to focus on his genital area where he exposed himself to Emily and proceeded to masturbate. Ritter turned off the webcam for a period of time. He, however, continued to engage in sexually explicit communications with Emily, including asking her if she tasted her ex-boyfriend's penis, her favorite sexual position, if her ex-boyfriend ejaculated inside her, if he used a condom, and if she performed oral sex on him. Emily cautioned Ritter that she was only 15 years old and she did not want them to get in trouble because of their respective ages. Unfazed by Emily's age, Ritter asked Emily, you want to see it finish? Ritter then turned on the webcam and ejaculated in front of the camera for Emily. Detective Veneman then notified Ritter of his undercover status and the undercover operation and directed Ritter to call the police station. Ritter was subsequently charged with unlawful contact with a minor. XUN. Official in Poconos to request dismissal of sex charges. Andrew Scott, September 1, 2011. The federal rules of evidence govern the introduction of evidence in civil and criminal proceedings. One of those rules is 404b, which states evidence supporting past criminal charges against a defendant is inadmissible during a trial on current criminal charges against the defendant. The rule makes an exception if the prosecution wants to use that evidence for certain purposes, such as trying to prove the defendant had motive to commit the offense with which he is currently charged, so long as the prosecution gives adequate pretrial notice to the defense of its intent to have that evidence introduced. Rokoczewski did an online search into Ritter's background after Ritter was charged in this case and found the June 2001 New York case. Without notifying Ritter's defense counsel, Rokoczewski requested records of that case from the Albany County District Attorney's Office, which agreed to release those records. The defense objected, saying the records were sealed and that New York law allows unsealing only for purposes of an ongoing police investigation. Having been unaware of any of this, Rokoczewski sent the records back to Albany County with a request to unseal and re-release them, which Albany County did under court order. Rokoczewski then gave copies of the court order and those unsealed, re-released records to the defense. So you still want me to find willful misconduct on the prosecution's part, even though the New York court order clearly allows the prosecution to have the unsealed records? Sibum asked Coleman on Tuesday. In other words, you want me to place no faith in that court order? Coleman said that, even in light of the court order, the prosecution still should have notified the defense that it was looking to obtain those records in the first place. Coleman requested also that Sibum order the current case's venue to be changed so that, if the case isn't dismissed, it can be tried outside of Monroe County. He's concerned that pretrial publicity possibly has prejudiced any potential jurors. After hearing oral arguments from both sides, Sibum will review legal briefs and decide whether to grant the defense's request. Sibum said she plans to reach a decision by early next week. Pocono record. Court ruling may upset conviction against former UN weapons inspector Ritter. Andrew Scott, October 25, 2011. On two separate occasions in Albany County, New York, in 2001, Ritter was accused of and admitted to meeting what appeared to be underage girls in online chat rooms and then going to locations to meet those girls, who turned out to be undercover police. Ritter was never tried or convicted in either case, and records of those incidents were sealed. After Ritter was charged in the Barrett Township case, Albany County Court in New York granted a request by Monroe County prosecutors to unseal those records, which the prosecution then discussed in court at the Pennsylvania trial. After Ritter's conviction, his defense team filed an appeal in New York challenging the Albany County Court decision to unseal the records. An appeals court last week ruled that the lower court erred in ordering them opened. Records are sealed to lessen the adverse consequences of unsuccessful criminal prosecutions by limiting access to official records and papers in criminal proceedings which terminate in favor of the accused, the appeals court wrote. Those adverse consequences include potentially severe damage to an individual's reputation and employment prospects. One exception lets a law enforcement agency obtain unsealed records if justice requires such records be made available, but only for investigatory purposes prior to, not after, the commencement of a criminal proceeding. In the court system, the decision states. In this case, the only reasons given for seeking the unsealed records were for their admission at trial, as well as to assist in sentencing and evaluation for sex offender registration purposes. University of Pittsburgh School of Law professor John Burkhoff said Ritter would have to accept whatever Pennsylvania law says about this issue raised on appeal. This is really interesting, albeit depressing for Mr. Ritter, Burkhoff said. Pennsylvania trials are governed by Pennsylvania law. Even if New York authorities screwed up under New York law, that is neither dispositive nor precedential in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania law controls, not New York law. Ritter's lawyers did not return calls Monday, but the defense team had said, even prior to the New York Appeals Court ruling last week, that it planned an appeal of the Monroe County conviction. Monroe County Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski said Monday that he is not too concerned about Ritter using the sealed records issue as grounds for an appeal. That's because jurors at trial are instructed not to determine a defendant's guilt or innocence in a current case based on unrelated prior incidents, Rokoczewski said. Jurors instead are instructed to consider if those past incidents show a pattern of behavior in the defendant, even if she wasn't convicted. The 2001 incidents in New York clearly show a pattern in Ritter's behavior, Rokoczewski said. Ritter said his controversial 1998 resignation from the UN drove him into a self-destructive depression that led him to spend more time in adult chat rooms and fulfill his sexual fantasy of having women watch him masturbate online. Ritter said he knew ahead of time that the girls he met online in New York in 2001 were really undercover police. He said he pretended to believe they were real minors and that he told both he would drive somewhere to meet and masturbate in front of them in a vehicle. He said he felt getting arrested by police was the only way to finally get help for his problems. Pocono record. Prison for ex-UN. Official Scott Ritter in Monroe sex sting case. Former weapons inspector gets up to 5.5 years. Andrew Scott, October 27, 2011. Convicted this week of unlawful contact with a minor and other offenses, former United Nations Chief Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter will be assessed by Pennsylvania and New York experts to see if he should be deemed a sexually violent predator. Quote, "Hold your head up high," quote, Marina Ritter told her husband, Scott Ritter, as he stood to address the court Wednesday shortly before being sentenced to 18 to 66 months in state prison. Deemed a sexually violent predator by the Pennsylvania Sexual Offender Assessment Board, Ritter, 50, of Delmar, NY, stood tall with his hands folded in front of him and paused to collect his thoughts before addressing the court. His wife dabbed at her eyes as she and friends sat behind him. Quote, "A lifetime of accomplishments weighed against a moment of human frailty," quote, the former U.S. Marine said in a clear, steady voice. Quote, "I take full responsibility for my actions. This should never have been made public. Something like this should be kept between a man and his family." Quote. Ritter said his wife and 18-year-old twin daughters have forgiven him and that he plans to spend the rest of his life being worthy of that forgiveness. He asked Monroe County Court Judge Jennifer Sibum to show leniency by sentencing him to a supervised non-incarceration community program that would let him be with his family. Quote, "If any man can stand here and say he's learned his lesson, I can," quote, Ritter said. Quote, "My family needs me now more than ever. And I need them now more than ever." Quote. He later closed his eyes and shook his head when Sibum agreed with a state expert's assessment of him as a sexually violent predator. Before the sentencing hearing began, defense attorneys Gary Coleman and Todd Henry requested the court grant Ritter a new trial. The request was based on a recent New York appellate court ruling saying that the records of two 2001 incidents involving Ritter in Albany County, New York, should never have been unsealed and then used by the prosecution in the Pennsylvania trial. On two separate occasions in 2001, Ritter met what appeared to be two girls, one age 14 and the other age 16, in adult chat rooms and traveled to different locations to meet the girls, who both turned out to be undercover police. Ritter told police at the time that his controversial 1998 resignation from the UN had led him into depression and self-destructive behavior that he had been hiding from his family, according to records. He said he had begun spending time in adult chat rooms and meeting women to have them watch him masturbate, and that he wanted to start doing the same with girls, records state. Ritter testified at trial to suspecting the girls he met online were really undercover police and that he went to meet them because he wanted to get caught so he could get help for his problems. This was contradicted by the fact that, when he went to meet the second girl at a Burger King, he drove by that location twice before turning into the parking lot and then tried to flee once he saw police, the prosecution said. Ritter was never tried or convicted in either of those 2001 incidents and the records were sealed. After he was charged in Monroe County in February 2009, the prosecution later got an Albany County court order to unseal the records and then used them at trial. After Ritter was convicted, his defense appealed the Albany County court order in New York. An appeals court there recently ruled the lower court had acted improperly when removing the seal meant to protect the privacy of someone who was never prosecuted in those incidents. Monroe County Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski opposed the defense's request for a new trial and the postponement of sentencing, saying the 2001 New York records had been accessible to the public online even though supposedly sealed and became even more public via local news coverage. Sibum agreed and denied the defense's request, saying she has no authority under the law to postpone sentencing and that she must obey only Pennsylvania law on what was admissible at trial in this case. The sentencing hearing then began with State Sexual Offender Assessment Board member Paula Brust testifying that Ritter has a personality disorder causing predatory behavior that likely would have continued had he not been caught. Brust said she went by the Monroe County and New York case records and that a court order obtained by the defense banned her from personally interviewing Ritter. The defense said Ritter has never been found with child pornography and that he passed a polygraph test when saying no, after being asked if he ever had sexual contact with a minor after his 2009 arrest.
Because the prosecutor is corrupt. Anyways, we tried to give him the computer, and my lawyer, first of all, said no. No way you're giving that computer to the prosecutor. I said, why not? He said, because they'll find something. I said, they won't find anything.
They'll plant something.
Well, that's different because no, you scan, you do a scan of it. So if they planted something, it would be different from the scan. And no, it doesn't work that way. We're not stupid. But we actually went out and hired an NSA, a former NSA and a former FBI cyber people, and turned the computers over to them. And they did a top to bottom scrub of everything. And they came back and said, ain't nothing on here, boss. So we went to the prosecutor and said, here's the computer. Prosecutor said, I don't want to touch the computer. I don't want to have anything to do with the computer. And we're like, but you should, since this is a computer crime. Nope. So
they just used their chat logs, basically?
They just used the chat log of an adult chatting with an adult. Yeah. Right. So we took the computer and we went to a retired special agent for the Secret Service, who was one of the first people involved in the computer crimes against children. He basically helped write the book for it. He has prosecuted over 25,000 cases, almost all of which were successfully put people away. And we came to him. Understand what I'm telling you. I'm going after the guy that prosecutes bad guys. I'm not going after the guy that defends bad guys. I'm going after the guy that prosecutes bad guys. And I said, I need you to look at this computer. And he said, no. And we said, why? And he said, because I will find something. Where there's smoke, there's fire. This is what I do for a living. People come to me and they say, do this, and I will find it, and then you're screwed. You're going to jail forever. They said, don't let me look at this computer. And my lawyer got scared and was like, I said, give him the computer. And I signed a waiver. I said, you're not a bad lawyer. I'm making this decision. Give him the computer. I have the letter. Someday I'm going to write the book and I'll publish the letter. The letter that the guy wrote to the judge. For the first time in his entire career, he said, because he said, I encourage people not to do this. I will find it. If there's something on there, I will find it. He said, for the first time in my career, I can write the letter I'm getting ready to write. There is no indication of a crime whatsoever. No indication of, a desire for underage children. There's nothing here. Yeah, there's this adult stuff, but that's his business. It's not none of my business. We're talking about a crime. There's no evidence of a crime. Not only that, he then went through the police report and he said, this is an unprosecutable case. There's no crime that was committed. But not only that, the police officer violated everything, every investigatory technique, et cetera, entrapment. I mean, the whole, everything you could do wrong as a cop, he did wrong.
He did. That's
so
right.
He said, not only is there no indication of a crime, but the cop, so he was ready to testify. This is like the leading expert in America, ready to testify on my behalf. And the judge went, no, inadmissible. We're not going to let him testify. And then they went and, and they got some files unsealed on incidents that occurred in 2001, which, by the way, again, none of your business, but no crime was committed. The case was thrown out, dismissed, and the files were sealed. That means, first thing, that it's a legal nullity. There's no crime. It's a nullity. It's sealed for a reason, because this stuff should never be in public life. The cop who leaked it, he initiated something and the FBI was brought in. This is a fact that not too many people understand. The FBI came in under orders from the Attorney General to get Ritter.
Brust said she considered all of this, but that it had no bearing on this particular case, which doesn't involve child porn, and that he was never asked about any sexual contact with minors prior to his 2009 arrest. New York clinical psychologist Richard Hamill then testified for the defense. Hamill said he treated Ritter after the 2001 incidents, giving him a series of psychological tests and then putting him in sexual abuser group therapy. Hamill said he has found Ritter interested in women, not minors. Hamill said he has been treating Ritter again since his 2009 arrest and that he believes Ritter's account of what happened in this case. Hamill added that he doesn't put stock in what New York police say happened in 2001. The defense then called several character witnesses who had sent the judge some of the letters supporting Ritter. These witnesses included an employee of the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs, a vice president at an international engineering construction company, and a Raytheon senior business manager, all parents of children between ages 12 and 13. All have known Ritter for years, described him as a stable, loving family man who has served his community and country with high integrity, and said they would support him in staying on the right path. Sibum considered all of this when imposing the sentence. While recognizing Mr. Ritter's tremendous contributions in life, I have to balance this with the safety of the community, she said. I'm troubled by the fact that his own statements and actions support the conclusion that he refuses to take responsibility for what he has done.
I will tell you that I engaged in no criminal activity, none whatsoever. Never have, never will. But what I did on the internet is not something that people should be proud of. It's especially if you're married. I'll be the first one to say that, but it wasn't criminal.
What if those minors had been real children and not law enforcement? Sibum denied the defense's request to postpone the actual commencement of Ritter's sentence pending the appeal they planned to file, after which he was escorted in handcuffs from the courtroom.
Well, I'm happy with the outcome. I think the jury reached the right decision. They saw the case for what it is and the defendant for what he is and for what he did.
Why did we get that one not guilty?
I don't know. I can't really speculate on that, but he was found guilty of the majority of the charges. And those charges in particular include the unlawful contact with the minor, which was specifically drafted and made for this type of activity, where officers can take a proactive approach instead of waiting for individuals like this to try to contact minors over the internet and victimize them. It allows the police and the officers, in this case Detective Ryan Veneman, to take a more proactive approach and try to prevent that from happening to actual minors. Sometimes, unfortunately, even though a person may know what they're doing is wrong, they may be intelligent enough to try to avoid it and get away, but however, sometimes the internal drive to engage in these types of deviant sexual behaviors is just too strong.
Anything to say?
Former weapons inspector Scott Ritter gets prison term. A former United Nations weapons inspector from Del Mar who exchanged explicit online messages with an undercover police officer. Daily Gazette reported by the Associated Press, October 27, 2011. Scott Ritter, 50, was taken into custody immediately after Monroe County Judge Jennifer Sibum sentenced him to 18 to 66 months behind bars. It was the second time in 10 years that Ritter found himself in legal trouble for trying to lure underage girls into illicit sex. Ritter, who maintains his behavior was shameful but not criminal, must register as a sex offender under Pennsylvania's version of Megan's Law. Quote, "I had no business being in a chatroom on February 7, 2009, quote, Ritter told the court Wednesday. Quote, "I've asked my wife for forgiveness, and I've asked my daughters for forgiveness, and they have given it to me." Quote. On Wednesday, Sibum acknowledged Ritter's service to his country and his support network of friends and family but criticized him for failing to take responsibility for his conduct. Quote, "I think what it would be like if it were my niece, Mr. Ritter's daughters or someone else's daughter in this very courtroom who was on the receiving end of that chat," quote, the judge said. Quote, "Children need to be protected. Quote, "A jury convicted Ritter on 6 counts, including unlawful contact with a minor. He plans to appeal the conviction and sentence." Ritter's attorney asked the judge on Wednesday to grant a new trial, basing the request on an appeals court ruling in New York last week that records from 2 previous incidents in that state in 2001 should not have been unsealed and given to prosecutors in Pennsylvania to be used at his trial. Attorney Gary Coleman argued the New York ruling entitled Ritter to a new trial because prosecutors based much of their strategy on the argument that Ritter had a history of preying on underage girls. Quote, "It became, as I feared, the tail that was wagging the dog at trial," quote, Coleman said in court. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rokoczewski argued the New York ruling had no bearing on Ritter's conviction and sentence in Pennsylvania. The judge rejected the defense request for a new trial, saying Coleman could bring up the New York case on appeal. Ritter told jurors at his April trial that he knew he was chatting with undercover police and set up the meetings so he would be arrested. Coleman has said Ritter used sexually explicit chats on the Internet as a way to handle his depression over being called unpatriotic for his criticism of American policy on Iraq. A member of Pennsylvania's Sexual Offenders Assessment Board, Paula Brust, testified Wednesday that based on his history Ritter is at risk to offend again. Quote, "He is not able to manage his offending in the community despite sex offender treatment," quote, she said. Ritter's therapist, Richard Hamill, acknowledged in court Wednesday that Ritter left treatment after the 2001 incidents. But he said Ritter's problem involves a compulsion to masturbate in front of adult women, not minors. He said Ritter has been attending weekly group therapy sessions since February 2009 and presents a low risk of reoffending. Times Union. Scott Ritter paroled in online sex case. Former UN. Weapons inspector imprisoned for contact with minor. Rick Carlin, December 4, 2014. Though the case dragged on, a New York appellate division court at one point ruled that some of the evidence was inadmissible. Ritter was convicted on 6 counts, including felony unlawful contact with a minor. Sentenced to up to 5.5 years, he was sent to Laurel Highlands State Prison in Somerset County, PA, in March 2012. Records show that the Pennsylvania Parole Board in June concluded Ritter had demonstrated positive behavior, had a quote, "motivation for success," end quote, and had completed the programs needed for release. Under the terms of his parole, Ritter can't possess weapons, must refrain from alcohol, and has agreed to drug testing and quote, "outpatient sex offender treatment," end quote. He can't have contact with anyone younger than 18 without approval from parole officials. Ritter was charged with unlawful contact with a minor, sexual offenses, unlawful contact with a minor, open lewdness, unlawful contact with a minor, obscene and other sexual materials and performances, corruption of minors, criminal use of a communications facility and indecent exposure. Ritter filed a motion to vacate the order entered unsealing the record in Albany County, which was denied. Ritter then appealed that decision to the Supreme Court of the State of New York, Appellate Division. Here is part of what the court said in reply to the appeal. New York courts cannot purge accounts of the arrests from the Internet, newspapers, and the minds of those who witnessed them. We rule in our December 16, 2010 opinion that evidence of the defendant's prior bad acts, including previous arrests, was admissible, and we stand by that ruling now. Even if the records in question were never unsealed, there were various avenues through which the Commonwealth could still have introduced evidence of the defendant's previous arrests. As such, defendant's motion for new trial under Rule 720 will be denied. Moreover, regardless of whether evidence of defendant's prior arrests were admitted, said records were not the sole basis for this court's decision, as other facts of record exist to support the sentence imposed by this court. Quote, "Ritter has continued to file appeals with no success in his case, and there are links available to find them in the notes section. up until the recent appeal on February 14, 2023, where he states is based on the Bill Cosby case. Here is Ritter in his own words.
What you don't know is that my current appeal is based on the Cosby case.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yes, because
So,
it's the same
you know,
thing. The prosecutor used evidence.
Here we had a judge. So they illegally got the file. They went back to a judge and illegally got 2001. And applying to it, what the prosecutor said is, we cannot successfully prosecute this case based upon what happened in Pennsylvania because there's nothing here.
Right.
We have to have 2001 so that we can manufacture a case. So you have to give us if you don't give us the file, we cannot prosecute this guy. So what he's saying is, whatever happened in 2009 between consenting adults isn't a crime. But what they have to do is convince the jury that I really intended to be talking to an underage person. So they thought they were going to get something in 2001, but they cherry picked it to make a case up. But it was illegal what they did. So we went to the judge and said, you can't do this. It's illegal. New York law. We cited it.
Apparently in Pennsylvania, they do it anyway.
All the time. Well, what she said is, I will not reverse the decision of a New York court, no matter what the soundness of your legal argument. If you want New York, she said, I will respect the decision of a New York court. If you want to change that, you have to go to the New York court and get them to change it. So we did. And we went to New York, we took it up the chain of command, and the highest court in New York said illegal as hell. It should never have been unsealed. Boom. We came back to the judge and said, hey. And she went, nah, we're gonna let it stay. I'm just telling you, the fix was in from day one. So, I mean, if people have a problem with this, I mean, again, if you're going to tell me that you object to what I did in an adults only chat room with another consenting adult, that's okay. I actually will say, I respect that. I understand that. If you're perfect, if your name is Jesus Christ or you're the Virgin Mary, I get it. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite, and God forbid somebody ever gets a hold of your Google search history.
Let he among us who is without sin cast that first stone.
Yeah, and but again, if that's their position, I can at least respect that. If you want to take a moral, principled stance based upon non-criminal activity and say, I condemn you for that, I'll be like, that's your business, no problem. That's the backstory.